Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Lamed Zayin. Today's stuff is sponsored by Natan in loving memory of her mother, Chaviva, Lilka, Bat Necha, and Abraham. Today's stuff is sponsored by Tina Lam in celebration of the engagement of her daughter Devorah to Daniel Batat of Jerusalem, Mazal Tov. Okay, we're going to get started with more understanding of pruzbol. Before I start, I want to mention that there were two shiurim that went up yesterday on our site. One is by on second thought from Rabbanit Yafit, all about this olvim ve'enam hane'elavim ve'enam olvim, and sort of from a philosophical machshavti perspective. So you can start with that, and then what we talked about in class about this whole machloket, about the two readings of the sugya, whether Rava is coming to respond to, have another explanation of Abaye to the basic question about shmita, or whether he was coming to answer a very localized question. So there's a whole machloket Rashi and Tosfot, which Rabbanit Shimoni goes into in depth in a very beautiful way, explaining a little bit more in depth what we discussed and more of the ramifications of it. So recommended listening also to that. Again, just to remind you all that we're in this chapter and next chapter are going to be a whole series of tikkun olam. Okay, tikkun olam is basically a situation, and it's for me, it's just so obvious. So I want to make sure I've gotten this across, which is that there's something fascinating here that's going on, that basically we take situations where the halacha, the dry halacha, as we call it, or the straight Torah halacha, creates a sort of tension where it's not necessarily working anymore, right? And it sort of puts you in a situation where you have to say, wait, stop. Is something not working right here? And maybe we need to change something. And it's what really allows for change in halacha. This in a particular manner, right? Change in halacha happens in all different ways. Often it's usually more subtle, right? Where it's, let's reinterpret so that it fits in. In these situations, it's not subtle at all. Somebody comes along and says, we need to make a change. And in order to preserve something else, right, we need to change something that's happening. And that was really, what we saw both in the first tikkun olam of Rabban Gamliel. How do we have something that, the rabbis came and instituted and it can uproot Torah law? And the same thing we asked yesterday. How does Hillel just come along and say something that goes against the Torah? So these are really fascinating topics. And today what we're going to see is also, besides the takana of pruzbol, first we're going to see how pruzbol works and how the rabbis used it. And even not pruzbol, how the rabbis also tried other ways to get around this whole concept of the obligation being canceled in the shmita year. Okay, all these loans. So we're going to start with my pruzbol at the very bottom of Lamed Baba Mebed. Where does the word come from? It's a very strange word, pruzbol. What's the root? Amrav chista pros buli ubuti. Okay, pros, most of the commentaries explain meaning a takana. Often pros means half, something like that. But in this case, they seem to be saying it's an institution for, or a takana for buli ubuti. Okay, that doesn't help us. What are buli, what are buti? It's not exactly a classic Hebrew word. It's certainly from the Aramaic or maybe even from some other language. Buli elo ashirim. Buli are the rich, and we're going to see that buti are the poor. And the answer is, right, it's like we said before, it's a takana for the rich and the poor. Right? On the one hand, it doesn't help the poor because now they're stuck and they have to pay their loans back, when theoretically the halacha was they go off without having to pay their loans back. On the other hand, right, it's kind of like giving them a grace. But on the other hand, it helps them because it helps the rich, and by helping the rich, it helps the poor. If the rich will get their money back, then they'll actually be willing to loan the poor. So again, the base halacha might hurt the poor because the poor won't get, right? We thought it was helping them, but it turned out to hurt them. So therefore we change it so that it helps both the rich and the poor. So how do we get the buli and buti are poor and rich? So we're going to prove that from different places. Buli are the wealthy. There's a pasuk in Vayikra and the curses. God will break our strength. V'tani Rav Yosef, elu bulaot shebiyuda. What does it mean, our strength? So the Braita, the Rav Yosef quote says, these are the bulaot of Yehuda. These are the strong people of Yehuda, which must mean the wealthy people of Judea. Buti elu aniyim dertiv, and this comes from a pasuk itself. Ha'avet ha'aviten. This is what it's talking about. You can take collateral for the loan, and ha'avet ha'avitenu is from the root avat, which has to do with poor people, so they say it's the poor. Amarle Rava Lila Oza. Rava said to someone who knew languages, my pruzbol, Amarle Porsa de Milta. Okay, so it doesn't really help us, but he basically said it's fixing. It's a fixing of something. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Yitomim ein tzrichim pruzbol. So now comes Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, and he says, now again, we're going to start to limit. Orphans don't need pruzbol at all. Meaning, if the orphans are to have a loan that was outstanding from their father and they want to collect it, they don't need a pruzbol. Shmita doesn't cancel their loan. Again, we're going to limit how many loans are actually canceled by shmita. As we're going to, number one, expand the use of pruzbol as much as we can, and also narrow, which are both doing the same thing, narrow the shmita ksafim, the cancellation of loans that was mentioned in the Torah. We're going to limit it. Doesn't apply to orphans at all. This is a pretty obvious one. Why? He said, he basically, Rami Bar Chama quoted a brayta that says this. Because Rabban Gamliel in his court, because it was a brayta, it was written in the time of Rabban Gamliel, obviously it's any really judges, are considered the fathers of the Yomi. Okay, they're basically they take care of the orphans. They make sure they have apitropsim and all that, take care of them. So it's as if their loan is in the jurisdiction of the court. And we already learned that once the loan is in the jurisdiction of the court, no rules of shmita apply, because shmita is between brothers and people on the same level and not the court. So Natan, another Mishna we're going to quote from there, from Shvi'it. Ein kotvim pruzbol ela ala karka. You can only write pruzbol. Okay, this is a limitation of pruzbol, but then we're going to expand it as much as we can. Pruzbol can only be written if the borrower has land. Okay, if the borrower doesn't have land, it can't be written. Why? This is a good question. Again, it seems, just like we saw before with Hillel, I mentioned there's this midrash about Hillel, that the reason what Hillel really did was made it as if, or either popularized, that you can give your shtarot to Beit Din. There's two main heterim that exist in early times for shmitat ksafim. The shmitat ksafim doesn't apply, number one, if you actually give your documents to the court and say, you collect the loan for us. Number two, and that's obvious because of the achicha, the brother, and the Beit Din is not our brother. The second thing is that if you give someone, you loan someone on collateral. We're going to get to that later in today's daf. And why is that? Because when you give me, let's say I loan you money and you give me an object for collateral, it's as if I've already collected the loan, because theoretically, if you don't give it back to me, well, I could just keep the collateral. So at that point, it's as if I already collected it. And shmitat ksafim is only for a loan that needs collecting. So these are two main heterim, or exemptions to this whole rule of pruzbol, which means basically that if we can now when they're going to go in this direction, they're going to say, well, then pruzbol can only be, first of all, pruzbol is like giving your shtarot to Beit Din, and it can only really be if it's like it's already collected. How would that be? Well, if you have land, then your land is usually, now we're going to talk about this later, but your land is usually mishuabad, it's subjugated to the loan, lien to the loan. So basically, it's as if it's almost as if I've collected your land. So therefore, we only write pruzbol in a case where you have land, because then at least we can hook into the fact that you could sort of say it's like I collected it. You can't really, but it's closer than if you have nothing. So that's the basic law. So now the question is, what if you don't? Well, we can't write pruzbol, right? Then, in a sense, it helps the really poor, because the really poor, their loans will really be canceled, right? You're really poor if you don't even own land. However, it hurts the really poor, because if you don't let them write a pruzbol on it, no one's going to lend the really poor money. So it's actually much worse for them. So therefore, they're going to try in all sorts of ways to figure out ways to get beyond this. If you don't have land, so what do? The lender, I could, just say, listen, I'm going to give you a little bit of land of mine that's going to be yours. And then I can actually write a pruzbol, and then I'll lend you money, because then I'll be able to write a pruzbol on it. V'kama koshu, what's a little piece? Even the stalk of a cabbage. Some people think this means actually the stalk of a cabbage that's attached to the ground. Because it's attached to the ground, they give you this one stalk. It's as if you own land, and then I can lend you money. I can lend you money with pruzbol. Some people say it actually means like a space, like the size of a cabbage stalk. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, afilu hishilo makom letanor b'letirayim. Even if I just lend you, forget about you own. I just loan you space to put your oven in my backyard. That's enough. Chotvim alav pruzbol. Ini, is this really true? You could just loan someone a space, but Hatani Hillel brings a brighter that says, "Ein chotvim pruzbol ela ala tzitz nakub bilvad." If someone owns a perforated pot, right, with a plant inside, remember we learned if it's perforated, it's as if it's attached to the ground. So if you own a perforated pot, I can lend you money on pruzbol because you own something that's attached to the ground. But what do you infer from here? Nakuv in, only if it's perforated. She'eno nakuv lo, if it doesn't have a hole in the bottom, then no, it's not considered attached to the ground. But let's say I give you a plant that's on the ground without a hole, so it's not attached to the ground, and I give you that, right? Let's say you own that. V'amai ha'ika mikomo. If I can lend you the space to put your tanur kirayim, then if you have a pot on the ground, obviously you also own the land right underneath that pot, because otherwise, how could your pot be on the ground if you don't have use of that land? So that space. So here it seems like having space is not enough. No, what it means is if it's on stilts, if you have a plant that has no hole that's on stilts, then that wouldn't be considered that you own land. But if it was actually on the ground and you had the space, it would work. And that then proves, if we understand the brighter in that way, then we don't really have a problem with what Rabbi Yehuda said, that you can loan someone the space to put his oven and burners on it. Rav Ashi machne legidma dedikla. This makes me think of the giving tree. He would give someone the stump of a tree, right? How does the book end with, well, at least I could sit on the stump, right? All I have is a stump. And he says, that's where I want to sit. So even the stump of a tree, that's enough. A tree stump is sufficient. Okay, he would basically give someone ownership of a tree stump in his garden, and then he'd be able to write pruzbol. By the way, you see not only that they talked about these things, but they did it. Rav Ashi himself, this is what he would do. So these are all heterim, as we say, ways to get around the basic law that you have to have land. We find all sorts of ways, and we're going to continue to find ways. Now we see another very big leniency here. We always understood pruzbol, and what we do nowadays is we sign a document. So it seems like you have to sign a document. You have to do this document in court. We said we had all the wording, ploni, you got ploni the dayanim, I'm giving to you, blah, blah, blah. But Rabbanan de Rav Ashi, the rabbis in the house of Rav Ashi, masrim milayhu lahadade. They would basically just say it orally. The Rabbi Natan, Master Milay, the Rabbi Chia bar Abba, he also just said it orally to Rabbi Chia bar Abba, and then Amarle, after he said it, I'm giving you rights to my stuff, whatever. Do I have to do anything else? He said, no, you don't need it. That's enough. Okay, so here you learn that you can even do it orally. Okay, not clear if these are only rabbis are allowed to do this orally, or really maybe anybody. Tanu Rabbanit, ein lo karka v'la'arev yesh karka. Okay, so now we said you have to have land. If you don't have land, and we can try to get you land in some way. But if you don't have land, no pruzbol. What if you don't have land, but the guarantor to the loan has land? Pruzbol. You can write pruzbol. Lo v'la'arev ein lahem karka. What if you, not you, nor the guarantor has land? Ulechayav lo yesh lo karka. Okay, let's say I loaned you money, but you're owed money by somebody else. So if the person who owes you money has land, that's fine too. Why? We're going to see 4 famous statements today. This is the first one. Okay, so I like to point out these things because these are things that kind of are just well-known, so it's good to know. This is called Shibuda de-rabinatan. Okay, it doesn't say the word Shibuda here. It kind of works like the transitive property in mathematics. Right? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. This is the same idea. Tanya, Rabbi Natan Omer, if I lent you money and you lent to somebody else, let's say you took the money and lent it to somebody else, even if it wasn't the same money, but you lent someone else money, then theoretically the court could come and say that if you lent money to someone else, I can go collect directly from them, basically. Okay, I can skip you. How do we know this? Okay, this is talking about when you pay back something that you stole. It's actually in Me'ila, misuse of consecrated property, but you pay it back. You give it la'asher ashamlo and not la'asher natanlo. So they say from there, it's unclear exactly how they learned it, but they seem to say the wording is a little different, which means you give it to the one who is supposed to pay it back, meaning that theoretically, how are you going to get the money? You're going to get it from this other person. So I can really get it directly from them because they're really the ones who can pay it back. So the point is here that since they have land, that's sufficient then, because theoretically I could just go collect from them. So even if you don't have land, the one who guarantees your loan doesn't have land, but someone owes you money, I can collect straight from them. And therefore, if they have land, we can write a pruzbol on this. So again, another big leniency for when we can write pruzbol. So now Natan, we keep quoting these Mishnayot from Masechet Shvi'it. This is like a whole section, right, on learning Mishnayot and Masechet Shvi'it because they're not usually in the Bavli, but here we're going to have a whole section of them. So Shvi'it cancels a loan, right? This is what I wanted, maybe I'm not saying it clearly, but this is the Gemara's opportunity to get in things that aren't in the Gemara at all, right? So they do this with Talmud all the time. That's why we're always learning things with Tum and Tara, because there is no Gemara on them, but they try to strip it in. Whenever it's mentioned, they mention all sorts of things about it. So likewise here, you would never get to laws of shmita if it were not for this. So once they mention shmita, they bring in all these things about it. So kind of like Hanukkah, right? The way Hanukkah came up and all those dapim and Shabbat, we got to it from one small thing. And then from there, they went into all these details about Hanukkah, because there is no Masechet Hanukkah. So now we're going to have different interpretations of this Mishnah. Okay, we're going to have Rav and Shmuel on one side, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish on the other side. What does it mean? So let's just explain the words and then we'll see what's up for interpretation. Shmita cancels a loan, whether it's a loan that was written with a document or without a document. So that would seem pretty simple. With a document, without a document. We either had an oral loan where we never wrote it down, or we wrote it on a document. But that's not the way they're going to understand it. Because there's really three types. There's two types of documents, and then there's oral loans. So the two types of documents are either with achrayut nechasim, that you lent me money. Let's say we keep going, I lent you money, and you said you pay me back even with land. That's usually. But you could also have a document where you say, I'm not paying you back with land, okay? I'm only going to pay you back with money I have. You have no rights to, right? No achrayut nechasim, no guarantee using my property as a guarantee. So now it says, Shvi cancels loans, whether it's b'shtar, whether it's lo b'shtar, but we have actually three things that we want to get into these two terms. So the question is, how do they fit in? So Rav and Shmuel Damar Travayu, b'shtar, ishtar sheyesh bo achrayut nechasim. A regular shtar usually means, once you have a milva b'shtar, it means that there's achrayut nechasim, there's a guarantee for my property. Shelo b'shtar, but if it's not with a shtar, it doesn't really mean shelo b'shtar. It means she'ein bo achrayut nechasim. It includes, okay, v'kol shekei milva peh. It includes both an oral loan and something that's like an oral loan. If we take a loan and we never wrote it down anywhere, then you can't collect. None of my property is lien to the loan. Likewise, I can write a shtar that says none of my property is lien to the loan. So that's really in the category of not having a shtar at all. So therefore, according to him, all three categories are included in those two terms, basically. Okay, everything, and that means Shvi'it is mishametet all chovo. Whether they're written with achrayut, without achrayut, doesn't matter. But Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish don't understand it that way. They think a shtar here, the Shvi'it cancels, is only if you didn't, the second type of shtar, where you didn't assume you didn't guarantee, you didn't put a lien on your property. And shelo b'shtar is moval pet, the way it seemed, not b'shtar at all. And then, shtar sheyesh bo achrayut nechasim, eino mishamet. If we had land liened, it's almost like what? Like a collateral. It means that you already know what land you're taking, right? You know where you could get the loan back from. So again, it's not missing someone collecting it. If someone needs to collect the loan, again, it does need to be collected. But again, it's less needs to be collected than other things. Collected usually means I have to get you to give me money. But if you don't give me money, I'll just take your land. So it's almost like it's easy for me to collect, in which case there's no issue of the Torah says lo yigos, which is you shouldn't be collecting it anymore. But I kind of already collected it because the land is really kind of with my name on it because you insured it. So according to Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, now remember, this is going to be very important in the story going forward. If I lent you money and there was lien property, that loan will never be canceled in the shmita year. Forget pruzbol. You don't need pruzbol. never be canceled. That's Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish against Rav and Shmuel. And not only do they say this, and that's how they read that Mishnah, but they have a braita to support, two braitas to support. Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Shtar Chov Mishamet. Okay, Shtar Chov is canceled in the Shemitah year, but like an IOU, a promissory note. But in Yeshbo, but if it's linked to property, no. And Tanya Idach, another braita says, Siyem lo sadecha balvato. If you say, specifically take from this land if I don't pay you back, Eino Mishameh, loan doesn't get canceled. V'lo od ela, and not only that, but even afilu katav, even if you said, Kol nechasai achalim v'alevim la, all my property is guaranteed to this loan. Eino Mishameh, it won't be canceled. So not only does Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish read the Mishnah in that way, they had two braita that supported their reasoning. But let's see what happens in this story. Krive de Rabbi Asi, okay, a relative of Rabbi Asi, he had a star, he gave money, lent money to someone. He lent money to someone that was linked to property, and he wants to collect his loan after the Shemitah year. So, Rabbi Asi, he goes to Rabbi Asi and he asks him, now, if you're Rav and Shmuel, you're going to say the loan is canceled. If you're Rabbi Yochanan, you're going to say the loan is not canceled. So let's see what Rabbi Asi says. He says it's not canceled, like Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish said. So this relative's all happy. He gets to get his loan back. He goes in front of Rabbi Yochanan, probably because he couldn't really go to the court of Rabbi Asi to be ruled. He was his relative. He kind of asked advice from the relative, understands from the relative what's going to happen when he gets to court. He goes to court, expecting Rabbi Yochanan's going to say, it doesn't cancel. What does he do? He goes to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says to him, Mishamet, the loan is canceled. His cousin, right, of Rabbi Asi goes back to Rabbi Asi and says, right, okay, we missed this point, but it's clear. Okay, they don't tell you all the details, but it's obvious. He goes back to Rabbi Asi and he says, you told me the loan isn't canceled. I don't understand. Why did Rabbi Yochanan tell me it is? So, to Rabbi Asi, coming to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Asi says, I'm going to go see for myself, right? Something is not right here. He goes to Rabbi Yochanan and he says, Amarle, Mishamet or Eno Mishamet? Is the loan canceled? Is it not canceled? Amarle, Mishamet, who says the loan is canceled. Vaha Marhu da Amar Eno Mishamet, but wait, aren't you the one who says Eno Mishamet? And I was in the Shiur, I heard you say it. You said it's Eno Mishamet. That's how you read this Mishnah. Amarle, here's the big line, which we saw already in the beginning of the Masechet, the two times this line is mentioned. Just because that's how I read the Mishnah doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to act upon that. And therefore, sorry, but the loan is canceled. Okay. Now, this is a very interesting use of this term. Why? Because first of all, it just goes on a little bit more. But okay, maybe you think the Mishnah is read that way. You don't want to, that's how you read it, but you might not want to act. But the Braita says explicitly like you. So, and there were two Braitas. Maybe that Braita is according to Beit Shammai. We know Paskan like Beit Shammai. Just because we found a Braita doesn't mean we hold that way. Da'amre, why would it match Beit Shammai? Because what does Beit Shammai say? Shtar ha'omed l'gvot ki gavoy dam. A shtar that is ready to be collected, kind of thing, like you could just go and take it from the land, is as if it's already been collected, and that's why Shemitah wouldn't apply here. But maybe that's only Beit Shammai, and maybe Beit Hillel doesn't agree with that. So with that, Rabbi Yochanan is not willing to do a maaseh. Now, what's interesting about this maaseh, now we saw this in the beginning, and let's talk about the katav al gabei katav. Okay, now that was different because that you could say, let's just be stringent. In this case, being stringent is actually, you're either lenient for one and stringent for the other. There's two parties here, right? There's both the lender, who's now going to benefit because the loan is canceled, but there's the malveh, who's going to lose their money because the loan is canceled. So there's two sides here. It's a little bit more tricky to say, let's just not do anything, because not doing anything, right, is actually hurting one party. It's not like we're just being strict. On the other hand, it goes back to what we saw yesterday with what Abaye said, which is sheva al taseh. Best to just do nothing and leave the status quo. What's the status quo? The money's in the hands right now of the loveh, and the malveh doesn't get anything. And we just leave things as they are because he wasn't really sure that just because he thought that that's how to read the Mishnah didn't mean that he was going to necessarily act upon it. Okay, there you have it. So far, two famous things today. Shibuda, de-rabinatan. You should always remember because it comes up a lot, right? That if someone owes me money and I owe you money, you can take directly from them. And this line about right? Sometimes we think it's some one way, but it doesn't mean we can really act upon it. And again, as I told you last time, Rabbi Yochanan, it's the only 2 times in the Gemara that it's mentioned, and it's both in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. It's non-hatam, another Mishnah. These are the 2 big cases where there is no shmita ksafim, just doesn't apply. Again, we talked about these already. One who lends money with collateral, takes an object for collateral, and moser shtar of the beitin, someone who gives the beitin responsibility to collect their loans. Bishlama moser shtar of the beitin tafsilu beitin. That one's very easy because the beitin already is responsible now. And again, it says achicha in the pasuk, and this is not your brother. This is right different levels of they're in a whole different place. They're not on the same level as you. But what about this collateral? It's because you already got something in your hands. Again, it means then you don't really need to collect. Wait, if you're going to say just because I have something of yours in my hands, so are you going to say from here, if I loan you money and then I live in your courtyard, is that as if I'm using it, right? I'm kind of holding something of yours because I'm using your property. And then the loan wouldn't be canceled. No. So Shane Mashkom, third important line for today. Rabbi Yitzchak had this opinion that when you take collateral, it becomes yours. Okay, it's not the same if I just live in your property, it's not mine. But if you give me something that I take into my house for collateral, I'm the owner of that collateral right now. Now, where does Rabbi Yitzchak get this from? From a pasuk. Where do we get this from? This is a section which talks about when you give money to a poor person and you take a collateral, every night you have to return it to them so that they can sleep with their blanket or whatever it is that you took. So you take it during the day and you give it back at night. And it says in that pasuk, if you do this and you return it every night, it will be conceived as a righteous deed in front of God. So which Rabbi Yitzchak says, if it's not yours and you give it back every night, what good deed have you done? It's not even yours. So he says it must be that you have ownership rights to this while it's in your possession. So that means that you own it. Because you own it, it's as if you don't have to collect your loan anymore. And that's why this is a huge exception. Okay, so that's also a very known halacha about this Rabbi Yitzchak, about the lachati yetztaka, that it can't be, it would be a good deed if you didn't own it, so you must actually own a collateral. Tnan hatam, another Mishnah. We just keep going all on these Mishnayot and Masachet Shvi'it, turning out to Amabet. Hamachzir chov lechavero b'shvi'it. Let's say you go to return a loan in the shmita year. We didn't have pruzbol, but you decide to come return my loan. Okay, we mean actually at the end of the shmita year. It gets canceled at the end of the shmita year. That's why it's just happened. We wrote pruzbols at the end of the shmita year. So you come to return me money, I have to say, mishametani. Okay? I have to say, listen, that loan is canceled, which seems to be saying you don't have to return it, right? But if you say, listen, I want to return it anyway, I can take it. Why? As long as we spoke shmita, like I said, mishametani, that's enough, even if we didn't actually do shmita. Well, we're going to go farther than that, which is, Amarabba, Rabba says, if you came to me and said, I want to return you the money, and I said, look, it's the shmita, the shmita year canceled the loan, Rabba says, V'talei ada amarhachu. Literally, and again, there's many different ways to understand this phrase, so I will just go with one of them. But we basically hang you, possibly literally, or maybe not literally, but kind of force you into saying ba'apapichen. If you already came to return the loan, and I say, listen, the shmita year canceled it, and I fulfilled zed dvar hashmita, I'm basically done because I spoke shmita, and really now you can return the loan. Okay? So Rabbi says, if you came to me originally to return the loan, then we make you return the loan, and you have to say ba'apapichen. And what you're basically saying in apapichen is, I'm just giving it to you as a gift. I know I don't need to return the loan, but I'm going to give it to you anyway as a gift. So Abaye says, what are you talking about? I'm going to bring a difficulty against you. Keshu noten lo. Says in a Braita, when he gives it to him, al yomar lo b'chovi ani noten lecha. So the truth is, I jumped the gun a little. It sounds like you just say, Af al pi chen, I'm returning you the loan anyway. So Abaye says, well, it says here, when he gives it to him, if he's going to give it to him anyway, you can only give it to him and say, I'm not giving this to you as my obligation. Ela yomar lo shalihen u'ma matana ani noten lecha. They're mine, and I'm giving them to you as a gift. Now, that's not what this person said. So Amar Le, Rabbi says, Talile nami ad amar hachi. He says, that's what I meant. What I meant is you force him into saying, I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm giving them to you as a gift. Okay, so now we're going to have a story where you're going to see something very interesting about the use of this kind of game, I call it, right? Abba bar Marta, Duhu Abba bar Yumi. Okay, he goes by two names. Interesting in our sefer about the names of what people are called by. Have a masik be Rabba Zuzeh. Okay, he owed Rabba money. Aitinu niale bashvi. So he brought it to him bashvi, really meaning after the shmita year. Amarle mishametani. So Rabba says what he's supposed to say, which is mishametani. Now, what's Abba bar Yumi supposed to say? Ba'af al pichen. Well, what does Rabba bar Yumi do? Shaklinu va'azal. He takes his money and he goes. He says, "Oh, I don't owe him the money. Great." He goes home with his money. Ata Abaye, Abaye finds Rabba. Now remember, Rabba was the adopted father of Abaye. So Abaye sees Rabba all upset. Amarle, Amayatzimar, what are you so upset about? Amarle, Hachi Abamase, tells him what happened. Azol Likabe. So Abaye says, fine, I'm going to go and tell him. He goes to the guy, Abba Bar Yumi. Amarle, Amtata Lezuze Lemar, did you bring money to Rabba? Amarle, he said, yeah. Amarle, Umay Amarlach, and what did Rabba say to you? Amarle, Mishametani, he says, your chov is canceled. Amarle, Va'amarle afal pichen, and did you say what you were supposed to say? And even so, I'm giving it to you. Amarle lo, he said, I didn't. Amarle, Abaye says to him, V'i amarle afal pichen, if you had told him this, hava shaklinu mina, he would have taken it from you. And now you go right now and you take that money and you give it to him and you say afal pichen. Pretty, right? This is like the talele. So he goes to Rabba, and Shaklum. So you'd think the story would end here. He basically goes, he gives him the money, he says, I'm giving it to you anyway, and he gives it to Rabba. But the story ends with Hamal. He said, and I assume it was Rabba who said, although I guess it could be Abaye, says, I think it was Rabba though, Lo hava beidate ba'yitzor Rabbanit mikara. This Talmid Chacham, this guy is not such a Talmid Chacham. He didn't really know his stuff, that he didn't know that this is what he was supposed to say. Okay, so they kind of insult this Abba bar Yumi or Abba bar Marta and say this guy didn't really know, he wasn't really such a scholar, that he didn't know the details about this. Okay, so last section of pruzbol, and then we'll go do a review. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Nachman, Ne'eman Adam Lomar pruzbol haya biyadi va'avad mimen. Another big head. Imagine you go to a bureaucratic office nowadays and you're supposed to bring the following documents and you forget your document, one document, they'll say, walk out of court, there's nothing to do. I can imagine myself in a situation where I get to there and I just double check I have everything. And then I see something's missing. I'm like, oh, wow, I better go home because there's no way they're going to take this, right? You have to give in the form. It's not there. You can't do it. But Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav Nachman that if you show up in court without your pruzbol and you say, listen, I had it, but I lost it. Okay, it could have been lost, right? How many times do we lose things? Or, mice eat documents, if you remember, and all sorts of things. So you're believed if you say I had it and I lost it. My taima, next famous line for today, or a fourth one. Kevan ditkinu Rabbanan pruzbol, because the rabbi instituted pruzbol, lo shavek hetera va'achelisuch. We assume that if you have two roads to go and one is the right way and one is the wrong way, most people are going to choose the right way to go. So that means that we assume that everybody deals with pruzbol. If you had loans out, you probably wrote a pruzbol. So therefore, if you claim that you wrote one and lost it, we believe you because the chances are that you wrote one. Because that people take, when it's not, again, this is usually when it's not a big deal, right? When it's not a big deal to write a pruzbol document. So because it's pretty easy, you just need to find 3 people to sign, or 2 people, right? Depending on Dayanim, Ploni, or Ploni, but basically it's not a complicated thing to do. So therefore, we assume that everyone's going to take care of it. So therefore, you're believed if you get into court and you say, listen, I had it, but I lost it, they'll accept it. And not only that, when someone came before Rav, when I came before Rav, I guess maybe it's Rabbi Yehuda saying this, midi pruzbol avad. Not only can you claim this, but the court can even say to you, imagine I get there without my documents. So I'm not going to say I have one and got lost. They're not going to care. So I just, I say, listen, I don't have one. I don't start making my excuses and my dog ate it and all that because, they're not going to really care. But since the court does care and they will believe you, so the judge opens and asks you, is it possible you had it and lost it? And this is a good case where we open the mouths of those who can't speak, right? We give them words to say. So we go so far as to suggest, okay, obviously we don't want you to lie and say, oh yeah, I did, like lying about it, but we believe you if you really say yes. None, but there's a Mishna that says, but Baal Chov comes, brings a shtar chov, he doesn't have his pruzbol, you can't pay back, right? They don't have to pay back the loan. So that seems to say the opposite. To which they answer, Tanai, it's a machloka between Tanaim. Here's our proof. The Tanya, it says in the Braita, Hamotzi shtar chov tzarich tehemo pruzbol. The Tanakama says you have to have a pruzbol. Chachamim omrim eino tzarich. The rabbis say you don't need because again, the assumption is they mean you can say I had it and it was lost. That's it for the pruzbol. We're going to now start a new topic, but before we do that, we'll do a quick review. We went through the etymology of the word, takana for both poor and rich. We had Yomi, orphans don't need pruzbol. We had you need land if you're going to do pruzbol, but the loven, the borrower, needs to have land. But we saw all sorts of ways to get around that. You can give him a little piece of land, teeny little bit of piece of land, a little space in your field. You can give him the guarantor can have, someone who owes the money can have, all sorts of possibilities. Then we talked about this machloket about whether shvi'it cancels loans if it was liened to property, maybe not at all. Right? Although Rabbi Yochanan wasn't willing to act upon it. We saw the two big heterim, Mavel Mashkon and Moser Shtar Kav Lebeitin, which are exempt entirely from the laws of loans being canceled. We saw within that some famous lines of the Shibuda de-rabinatan. If you owe money to someone and they owe to someone else, you can collect from them. We saw the Rabbi Yitzchak about the mashkon being owned. We saw the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, just because we think so, doesn't necessarily mean we should act upon it. Then we went into this whole game that's supposed to be played. If someone tries to give you money back, then you accept it, but you just have to say the words, oh, but shmita canceled it, even though you don't really mean it, right? But as long as you say words of shmita, that's enough. And then we basically push people into giving you back the money anyway. And you can say, I lost it and be believed. Okay, and that's based on a principle, lo shapitetera va'achalisura, our fourth important statement for today. Now we move on to a Mishna that we're not going to fully understand yet. We're going to have Rava and Abaye arguing about what the Mishna means and what case the Mishna is talking about. Eved shenishba, we have an Eved Caananite. He's a Caananite slave. If you remember, Caananite slaves become the possession of the owner. They become Jewish. They pseudo-convert. They're sort of Jewish. They do a brit milah. They dunk in the mikvah, but they're not fully Jewish unless you free them. When you free them, they become a full-fledged Jew, although you're not supposed to free them. So now, and they're considered second-class citizens because they are slaves. So that's going to somewhat possibly affect what we're going to talk about here. Eved shenishba upta'u. If an Eved becomes taken into captivity by Gentiles, we redeem him. Okay, now there's two ways that we can redeem him. We can redeem him im l'shum Eved or ilishum ben cholin. You can redeem him. Okay, let's say I'm the owner, but you redeem my slave. Let's say I don't do it. I don't have the money, or I don't want to spend the money. You can redeem the slave either by saying, I'm redeeming you as a slave and you'll remain a slave, or you can redeem him saying, I'm redeeming you and paying your way to freedom. Okay, so those are two possibilities. And the question is what works and what happens to the slave when you do those following things. And then we'll have to figure out what exactly is the tikkun olam here. What do we fix it? So this slave, now you have to wonder, right? People aren't so motivated necessarily to free slaves because on the one hand, we want slaves to be free. Why do we want slaves to be free? Because they are somewhat Jewish. They're supposed to keep mitzvot. When they're living with Gentiles, it's going to be very hard for them to keep mitzvot. On the other hand, people don't treat slaves so well, they might not care so much. So Eved shenishba upta'u. So if he becomes taken into captive and you redeem him, not the owner, in l'shum Eved ishtabed. If you say, I'm freeing you to continue, I'm paying your way out so you could still be a slave, then he's still a slave. Now the question is, slave to who? To me, the original owner, or to you? That's going to depend whether we go with Rava or Abaye. In l'shum ben cholin, if it's to be a free person, lo yishtabed, then he's free, which kind of makes sense. You bought his way out to freedom. I kind of lost him because he got taken away. You paid his way to freedom, and now he's free. Although we'll see, maybe it's not a little more complicated than that. Rashbag Omer, ben kach ben kach yishtabed. Rashbag says no matter what, he stays a slave, even if you freed him to be a free person. So now we're going to have to understand b'mayaskina. What's the case? Well, maybe it depends on whether I gave up on ever getting him back. My slave was taken into captivity. I can either be hoping that I'll get him back one day and don't really ever give up my rights, but we've learned already, if I have yeush, I kind of say, oh, I give up on this person, then it no longer belongs to me. That's yeush. Okay, we'll get into Baba Metzia when we lose. That's why if you find a lost item, you can often keep it because you can assume the owners, right? You find a $100 bill on the floor, you can take it because whoever lost the $100 bill might want it back, but they basically know as soon as they left it in the middle of Manhattan, there's no way they're ever getting $100 back. So you can pick it up and take it, but you don't have any responsibility to return it. And that's the whole thing about when do we assume people have yeush or not. So that's an easy case where it's pretty obvious. So now the question is, if this happened before I gave up my rights, then l'shum ben cholin amai lo yishtabed. If he freed him to be a free person, what right did he have to do that? He was my slave, so he should still be a slave. Ela la'achar yeush, and if it's after I gave up my rights, well then l'shum eved amai yishtabed. Well then he shouldn't go back to being a slave at all. Certainly shouldn't go back to being my slave. So Amar Abaye, listen, right, because I gave up my rights to him. So Amar Abaye lo'olam lefnei yeush. It's really before I gave up my rights. And Rava is going to say the opposite. And now we're going to go through and see, according to each one, what's the takana here. Ulishum eved. So if I haven't given up my rights and you free my slave, yishtabed l'rabo rishon. He goes right back to me because he was my slave and you just freed him for my sake. Lishum ben cholin. If you did it to be a free person, lo yishtabed lo l'rabo rishon v'lo l'rabo sheni. Why is that? Well, lo l'rabo sheni lo dahalishum ben chorim parke. Okay, it's certainly not going to work for you because you freed him to be free, not to be your slave. So definitely not that. L'rabo rishon nami lo, and here's the tikkun olam. He doesn't go back to work for me. Why? Even though he's really mine, you freed him to be a free person. Why? Dilma memane v'lo parke. What's the motivation for you? You have really no motivation to free this slave, especially, right? He's my slave. If he's going to go right back to working for me, you're going to say, why should I free Michelle's slave? Let her do it herself, right? So since we really want the tikkun olam is we want to free these slaves. So we motivate you to free him by saying, if you free him, he'll be a free man. And then at least you freed him entirely. And that's your motivation, so to speak. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, ben kach ben kach yishtabed. He says, you don't need to motivate people to do this. And therefore, no matter what, since there was no yeush, he'll go back to being my slave. Why do you not need motivation? He basically says the mitzvah. Since the mitzvah, people don't need incentive. What incentive do they have more than it's a mitzvah? The mitzvah is their incentive. Since it's a mitzvah, obviously Tanakama doesn't think it's a mitzvah to redeem slaves. It's a mitzvah to redeem Jews, but it's not a mitzvah to redeem slaves. God says, what are you talking about? It's a mitzvah to redeem slaves. Therefore, you don't need any motivator. So according to Abaye, the tikkun olam is according to Tanakama, and if you free him to be a free person, then he'll be free because otherwise you won't really be motivated to free him just to go back to being my slave. Rava amar la'olam la'achar yeush. He says, no, we're talking about after you've given up already. Or I've given up on him. If you free him to be a slave, you basically bought him. Okay, you bought him to be your slave. So he's your slave, not my slave, because I gave up my rights already. That's obvious because l'rabo sheni though is not going to be yours because the halashum ben chorim parket. You already redeemed him to be a free person, and the rabo rishon nami lo de lachar yeush. I already gave up my rights to him, so he's owned by nobody at this point. So when you buy him out, you buy him to get his freedom. Okay, that's if you did for freedom. Notice neither of these are tikkun olam. This is just the law. The tikkun olam according to Rava is going to be in Rashba. From Shimon ben Gamliel omer ben kach ben kach yishtabed. Why? Now, here's a totally different tikkun olam. Why, no matter how you free him, he's still going to be a slave, even though there's yeush, and even though you freed him to be a free person, still is going to be a slave. Why? His Chizkiah said, if this guy really wants his freedom, what will he do? he'll get himself taken captive, hope that someone will free him, and then he'll automatically go free. So we're going to have all these slaves trying to get themselves taken into captivity, and we're going to have to all pay all this money to free them. And that is obviously not in our best interest. So to avoid that kind of problem, this isn't to help the slave, this is to help the owner. To avoid that problem, we're going to say no matter what, he stays a slave. And that way there won't be incentive for them to get taken into captivity. So totally different tikkun olam. One is takana, one is responsibility tikkun olam, one is to help the slave, one is to help the owner. Meitive. Question on Rava, the second one. So now we have this quote, Amar lahem Rashbag in a Caananite source, Kashem shemitzvah likdot et ben cholin, kach mitzvah likdot et avadim. Just like you have to free ben cholin, you also have to free slaves, and that's his response. Now we quoted that in the Abaye reading, not in the Rava reading. So Bishlam al Abaye damar lefnei Yush, that's exactly why he said this. Hainu t'kamar kashem. Ela l'Rava damar lachai Yush, hai kashem mishum b'chizkiyahu. The whole reason has nothing to do with this, it has to do with Chizkiah. So why was that his response to the rabbis? So Rava could answer, Rashbag lo hava yadamai ka'amar Rabbanit. As in Rava's reading, you can read it like this. It's after Yeush, but perhaps Rashbag wasn't sure that that was what the rabbis were saying. And he said to him the following, Hachi Kamarlahu, he said to them, if you're talking before Yeush, Hainu Kashem, then I'll tell you that you don't need it because it's a mitzvah, so they don't need incentive. And Ila Achar Yeush Kamaritu Kidchizkiah. And if you say it's after Yeush, then I'll give you the Chizkiah quote. And then he's kind of saying both. Last question for today. We have two problems with Rava. The first was this Braita, which we responded to. But the second is, if it's after Yeush, and the second, you buy this slave for the purposes of being a slave, right? So who's he buying it from? Mishabai, from a guy who took him into captivity? Shabai gufe mi Caananite. He doesn't actually own, this Gentile stole the slave from me. He's not the owner, so how can he give you rights and acquire this for you? To which they say, in Caananite l'maaseh yadav. He does. He acquires him for his maaseh yadayim, what he produces. Okay, da'amar rish lakish menai lovei kochavim shekonei ta'ovei kochavim l'maaseh yadav, shene'emar v'gam im dei ha'toshavim ha'galim imachem mehem tiknu. You can buy slaves from the Gentiles. That's how you buy Canaanite slaves. And if you buy them, atem konim mehem v'lohem konim mikem v'lohem konim zeh mizeh. You can buy from them, they can't buy from each other, and they can't buy from you, but when you acquire from them, it's actually, you're acquiring it from them. And there you see that you can acquire from them. There is this type of ownership that they have over the slaves also. So in any case, we have, again, just quickly review this section. We have an Eved that was taken into captivity, Machloket Tanakama Rashbag. We saw two different interpretations before I gave up my rights or after I gave up my rights, to where I thought, I kind of gave up and thought I was never going to get the slave back. We had Abaye, we had Rava, and each one understands the takana in a totally different manner. And then we just had two questions on Rava, which we answered both of them. That's it for today. Wishing everybody a great day.